Hello, chaps and chapettes. Screezilla here, and I hope you're all well. So, French tanks, sacre bleu. Uh, Vive la France, Révolution des Français, uh, army, derrière, something or other. Mechanics. Yeah, it's terrible French, I know. Anyway, today I'm going to be looking at what we may possibly be getting for the French tech tree. Now, of course, this is speculation, as ever, but a few ideas on what we most likely will get for the lower tiers. Now, one thing I highly expect for the French tree is armoured cars. In fact, I expect there to be a full lineup with tier 6 TDs in the mix with armoured cars. It's just a hunch. The French employ a highly mobile fighting force. Ever since their defeat in the Battle of France of 1940, the French have gone on for employing slow... Before that, the French had slow breakthrough tanks to a fast, mobile, rapid-firing gun platform. Now, that's not to say they do not still employ some slow, heavy guns, but the majority of their vehicles tend to be highly mobile. Now, of course, I'm going to miss a fair few tanks off this list, and they may well all be wrong, but we will give it a jolly good go and see what we can find out. Let us start with some armoured cars. So, first up, light vehicles armoured cars, the Citroën 2CV 70mm or M2 Browning variant. Okay, the first one is a long shot, but boy would it be fun. The Citroën 2CV 70mm or M2 Browning gun car. Okay, now this is unlikely to happen, but boy would this thing be fun. The TCV is designed to allow farmers to drive across ploughed fields without breaking eggs. It was the everyman car. And it had a military history too. It was used as an airdrop vehicle, planned to be used in the early 60s with either an anti-tank recoilless rifle on board with over 300mm of penetrative ability. It's crazy. Or, more likely for the game, the M2 Browning heavy machine gun. Likely to be applied as a AAA vehicle. This may well be a silly premium vehicle, and I do not see it actually being added, but it would be amazing if it was. Just imagine a Citroën 2CV owning a tank. It would be amazing. Just look at this thing, it's a beast. So yeah, if it does get added, tier 1 for the AAA vehicle, and tier 3 for the recoilless rifle. I don't see the recoilless rifle being added because it's just stupid, but God would I be happy if it was. Alright, let's get on to some more serious stuff. So next up we have the Lafayette AMD 50. Hopefully that will be showing up on the video. There we go. So this is the classic interwar armoured car, and possibly one of my favourite looking vehicles of all time for armoured cars. The Lafayette AMD 50 was based off the American white TBC 1.5 ton truck. There was also some British armoured car variants on this as well. There's actually one of these at the Tank Museum at Bollington if you want to go check one out. The AMD 50 has a turret atop of the hull with a 37mm SA-18 gun, get used to me saying that gun, along with a Chanticleer M1931 7.5mm machine gun sticking out the back. The truck had impressive armour for the time with 35mm, weighing in at 6.5 tonnes with a 50 horsepower engine. It only has two-wheel drive though. The Lafayette will be slow off-road, however on-road it will be capable of up to 50 miles per hour. This would be a tier 1 vehicle for sure. It would be a very good tier 1 armoured car. Kind of an interesting one as well. Next up, we have the Schneider AMC P16. Now, the Citroën Kagres was an armoured half-track developed by Citroën and Russian engineer Adolf Kagres. It was designed around the law at the time. The French cavalry were not allowed to use tanks. Yay, bureaucracy. So to get around it, rubberized metal tracked half-tracks were developed. This model was taken into service in 1923. However, that However, what we will likely get is the replacement, the Schneider P16, and it was relatively good for speed at the time, although it did lack armour with only 12mm of protection, meaning it will only be effective against small arms fire. The turret had a 37mm low velocity Putty-X gun in the front turret and a 7.9mm Hotchkiss machine gun bull mounted in the rear of the turret. It was operated by the commander, which the main gun was too. The biggest problem for these tanks is, of course, the fact they only have one person in them. But it did fight in the Second World War bravely. Didn't go too well, but it did its work for 20 years. The majority of them broke down, being worn out after 20 years. Now we'll move on to the White Laffy AMD-80, the replacement for the AMD-50. Now, this was a completely revamped vehicle, and none of the old Laffy remained, including that of the old white chassis, which gave it its name. However, the name was kept for historical sake. The car only had drive at the rear and steering from the front axle, although it did have two driving positions for forwards and backwards. Of course, reverse, it required great skill to drive, as it became front-wheel drive with rear-wheel steering. It had a good cruise speed on flat African roads, could get up to 50 miles per hour, however it did suffer off-road, although it was capable of climbing steep inclines and had an okay off-road performance. Built in 1934, it was out of date when it was put into service. It was armed with a 13.2mm heavy machine gun and two 7.5mm machine guns. Had 8 to 20mm of armour and a top speed, as I said, of 50 miles per hour. It will be another Tier 1 vehicle. Quick sip of coffee there. I can't do these lists without coffee. Next up, the Panhard 165 and 175 variants. Now, this is likely to be added. The Panhard was designed for operations in the Middle East and the deserts of the French Empire, and saw service exclusively in North Africa. It was a fast scout vehicle with two uses. The first had a 37mm SA-18 cannon designed for tank hunting, although there was a 25mm autocannon variant too. The SA-18 actually had a very high rate of fire too, capable of 15 rounds per minute, and having around 40 to 50mm of penetration, although on the Panhard it was a short barrel which did affect its accuracy. Weighing in at around 8 tonnes with 4-wheel drive and a 4-cylinder 150 horsepower engine, the car was capable of almost 45 miles per hour. It also had 20mm of frontal armour. An anti-air variant was made with the Ribiel M1935 7.5mm machine gun placed behind the driver compartment. These will likely be Tier 1 vehicles, maybe early Tier 2. Here you see the anti-air variant, and as you can see, the machine gun is placed sort of in the top of the vehicle where the crew compartment is. It's got a relatively heavy anti-air gun, but it's going to be a bit crap in all honesty. Okie dokie. Speaking of Panhards, next up we will be having the Panhard 178. Once the video catches up. The best armoured car of World War II, at least in my opinion. And at least for the French. This vehicle was heavily used by the Germans after the fall of France too, with the Schneiderpanzer rail car and the Schneiderpanzerwagen. The car had a 4-wheel drive system, 4-cylinder engine giving it 105 horsepower, with around 20mm of armour, giving it fantastic speed of 46 miles per hour. The car had a mounted 20mm SA-35, which was reworked to a Hotchkiss 25mm anti-tank gun. So there was the two variants. This is the rail car just there. The short muzzle along with the special tungsten core APCR rounds were capable of going through the front armour of the Panzer III with ease. 50mm of penetration with that gun. However, due to its small size and lack of explosive filler, it didn't cause much damage to the tanks. It also had the capability of twin 7.5mm Ribiel machine guns, one which could be mounted on top of the turret for AAA use. This will likely be late tier 2, early tier 3. There may also be a second turret design with a larger Renault turret fixed to it. Okay, now we move on to a possible premium. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Panhard AM40P. Likely a premium tier 1 tank. This prototype was an 8-wheeled vehicle, had 8-wheel drive, and it was an all-terrain heavy armoured vehicle. It had almost 60mm of armour with highly angled armour at the front. It would also have had an oscillating turret, which we'll get into more detail next video, which would have had a 25mm SA-35 anti-tank gun along with a 7.5mm machine gun. The car was capable of 40 miles per hour. The middle four wheels were capable of being lifted with hydraulics, so the car could have better on-road performance. The middle wheels, as you see here, have got a lot of grip on them, so these were designed for traction for off-road purposes only. This vehicle is going to be a very interesting one if it gets added, and this is the sort of thing you can expect with the French armoured cars later on. I imagine it'll be a tier 1 late or an early tier 2 premium, but the French developed on this idea later on, and they have some very interesting tank destroyers with this design. So yes, I am looking forward to this one. It should be interesting. Okay, next up we have the French light tanks. The French were very much in favour of light tanks, wanting to swarm the enemy with masses of cheap light tanks rather than having 1 or 2 medium or heavy tanks. This of course led to the German tactics of the Blitzkrieg, yet they used heavier armoured tanks rather than light ones, and the French suffered horribly in 1940 due to many of their tanks lacking the punch to go through the German armour. However, ironically, the Germans had the same issue, but they had faster tanks, so they could outflank and get the weak points. So, we are starting with the ever-classic, the Renault FT31. Now, this has to be the first tank in the French line. Of course it will be. If it's not, I'm going to Russia, going to find Gaijin, knock on the door, go to the lead developer of the vehicles, smile and punch him in the face. The Renault FT was the first modern tank, i.e. a hull with a turret. Designed in 1916 with the first prototype in 1970, it was revolutionary at the time. A 2-man vehicle with speed of only 4 miles per hour and only 20mm of armour. This will be an easy tank to kill, but it is iconic. The male tank with its Pertex SA-18 37mm gun is what we will get if we get it. Although only a small gun, it is capable of going through the frontal armour of a Panzer III. Yet, small payload means little damage will happen when penetrated. This will definitely be a reserve vehicle. Next up, the Renault NC1, a modernisation of the FT. We already have aspects of this tank in game with the Japanese tech tree, Russian tech tree as well, with a few chassis. Even actually some of the American tanks, I think, have some of the same chassis as this thing. It was a much faster variant with the aid of a 60 to 75 horsepower engine. It also had thicker armour, with some points up to 30mm. It also had a coaxial machine gun, a 7.5mm machine gun, and the same 37mm gun as well. The French never deployed this tank. The French never deployed this tank, however, and did not really use it. However, many other nations did. Again, this would be a reserve vehicle. It was designed for the French army, but it just wasn't used. Okay, next up, Renault NC1. Oh wait, not the Renault NC1. The Renault AMR35. These light scout tanks were designed in the mid-30s and would work well as a good low-tier vehicle. Although the first editions were only armed with a light 7.5mm machine gun, later models were made with heavier weapons. The ZT variants is what we will likely get. The ZT1 was armed with a heavy 13mm machine gun, so likely another reserve tank. The ZT2 will be a much better option, and these will likely form the starter to the tank destroyer line of vehicles as well. This was armed with a 25mm SA-35 cannon with armor-piercing HE rounds. Having a top speed of 50 miles per hour, it gets this speed by losing some armor, however, only 13mm of armor. However, it will work well early tanks in low-tier games. Now, next up, the AMR-35 ZTE-3 SPG. Now, this is a tank hunting variant of the AMR-35. This tank has a fixed turret armed with a Hotchkiss 25mm SA-34 L72 automatic anti-tank gun. It also had slightly stronger frontal plate armor. Again, this will be a low BR tank, as the small caliber rounds, despite having good penetration, will not cause much damage yield. So I expect this tank to be sort of very early, low tier tank destroyer, beginning of the line basically. It will be an interesting vehicle to have. As I said, the French have a lot of very small guns with very good penetration though. They rely more on the rate of fire than the actual penetration and explosive punch of the guns. Okie dokie. Next up, the Renault R35/40s. Now, the R35 is a much more advanced light tank, and this brings us to tier 2 for sure, or maybe late tier 1s. It has many of the common features of French tanks at the time: good armour, terrible guns. The R35 is very similar to one of the rivals in the French tank tree, the Hotchkiss H35. The R35 has 43mm of frontal sloped armour, which was capable of stopping in the German 37mm guns with relative ease. Their own guns were capable of punching through Panzer I and IIs, but not much else, unfortunately. The Panzer IIIs and IVs did tend to pose quite a big threat to them. However, 12 miles per hour top speed, it is slow. Yeah, compared to many other tanks, this is very slow. There was a long-barreled 37mm L35 SA-38 built, with the ability to penetrate up to 40 to 50mm of armour, so that will be quite a good little tank to have, because the muzzle velocity on the French guns is really impressive. They're almost to the 1000 meters per second range. Now, speaking of the Hotchkiss, next up we have the Hotchkiss H35, the most frustrating tank for the German army. June of 1940, the German army have had no real issues. The Polish tanks did not offer total resistance. They did have a bit of resilience, but their riveted armour was not a match for the PaK-36 anti-tank gun. Germans hide with pride and knowledge they carry. They can not be stopped attack France. In the distance, a tall light tank slowly appears. It looks a little goofy with its cupola, but it's so small, what's it going to do? And it's relatively slow compared to the German tanks. The German troops quickly come to a stop, line up their PaK-36s. The tanks are slowly coming. They can easily get their aim on them, and they're just coming in frontally at them. The story will continue shortly. The Hotchkiss H35, boy do I love this tank. It was a beastly little thing. Armed with a Partax SA-38 37mm gun, a short and long variant giving up to 40 to 50mm of penetration, weighing in at 12 tons and having an inline 8-cylinder engine, giving the tank 120 horsepower, the Hotchkiss was actually capable of almost 23 miles per hour on the flat. But the big thing for this tank was the sloped 40mm cast armour, similar to that of the Sherman's cast hull, which made this thing a monster at the time. The German gunners fire. A salvo of PaK-36s fire off, and all the Germans hear is the sound of bells. Ding, ding, ping, ding. The Germans can't do anything against it. It caused panic to the Germans because they just could not penetrate it. The German gunners fire salvo after salvo at this thing, and nothing goes through. However, It was good at breaking lines of gun infantry, but when it came to a tank, it was hopeless. The tank lacked radio communication, and it also had to deal with the incompetency of the French command, and thus not prove itself that much worth. Many were abandoned from lack of fuel, very few were damaged. The tank served until mid-1950s and took part in the Sinai campaign in 1956. However, they did have a more advanced gun for the tank. Now, this will be a low tier 2 tank. The H-39, which is an upgraded version with a 6-cylinder engine, radio equipment, and a long barrel SA-38, was slightly faster and lighter than the 35, but not many more changes were made. That will likely be T2 after the 35 tank. Next up, we have the Sommer S-35, and this is our medium tank line. So the Sommer S-35, highly modern tank at the time, and one of the few tanks to get a few good victories over the invading Germans. With great armour and very good gun for the French, it was one of the few tanks that could actually duke it out with another tank of the German side without much issue. It was one of the most widely used French tanks for the German army to go to unmodified after the war, after the invasion of France. The S-35 was also pivotal to Dunkirk due to its cast-hull armour and the gun. The S-35 pushed back German forces with a few other tanks such as the B-1 and R-35. They managed to capture hundreds of German troops not expecting a pushback, and their assault was only stopped by the Luftwaffe using their Flak 88 guns for the anti-tank purpose for one of the first times, which crushed the French assault. The tank was also used as a base blueprint for the the M4 Sherman with the cast hull armour. It was revolutionary at the time. I also suspect the S40 will be the upgraded model, more powerful engine, again, similar to the H39, not much difference, just a more powerful engine, a few little bits there. So 25 to 20 miles per hour, 48mm of frontal armour sloped, effective of almost 60 to 70mm of armour, the 47mm SA-35 gun, that will punch through pretty much anything, and 2 Rebier 7.5mm machine guns. Okay, now we move on to heavy tanks. The French had some of the coolest heavy tanks out there before the war and at the start of the war. Some seriously big boys. The Char B1, B1 Bis, and the B1 Tir. We know we're getting the Tir, but the Bis will be the regular Tech-Tree tank for sure. The B1 was the Wehrmacht's most feared enemy tank, a mechanised nightmare which caused heavy casualties by itself during a few fights in which it was engaged. The Germans never experienced such losses in tank-to-tank combat until the fall of 1941, when they encountered the Soviet KV-1s and T-34s. The Panzer I and Panzer II were absolutely harmless to the B1, and the Panzer III, with its thin armour and 37mm gun, presented no serious threat to the French Super Heavy. As for the Panzer IV, it only had 20mm of protection. Its standard gun was the low velocity short barrel 75mm at the time, the KWK-37, which was only effective at short range. For this reason, the Panzer IV barely presented a real threat except in close combat. Real-time coordination with other vehicles was highly needed. The same could be said about most German anti-tank guns of the time too. The famous standard issue Doorknocker Pak-37 and even the Pak-40 were harmless to this tank. Contrary to common opinion of the time, the large ventilation exhaust panel was indirectly 55mm strong and never penetrated as a weak point. And that's the exhaust panel you can see in this picture. So, speed, 17 to 13 miles per hour. Armour, 60mm of sloped armour. A 47mm SA-35 anti-tank gun. And the 75mm SA-35 howitzer, which fired high explosive shells which were capable of knocking out most panzers. The B1 will be a tier 2 and act very much like the Churchill tank. Now, right here we actually see an interesting variant. You may think this is actually a Marder, but it kind of is. It's the Marder Char. This was a German modification with a big anti-tank gun on it. I think it was a 70. No, it was 105mm gun. I think. No, 110mm. It was the 110. It was the 10cm gun, as seen on the Panzer 10cm. Yeah, so I'm interested to see how it goes with the German modifications if we'll get them. Here we see the back of the Shah as well. As you see, there's an escape port at the engine port. This tank was so big you could walk through the whole thing. Now, as big as the Shah was, it's a midget compared to this Shaw Premium Behemoth. The next tank that I hope we get, and I'm pretty sure we will, is the Juggernaut. Oui, the FCM-2C Super Heavy. A breakthrough tank from the World War One, designed to cross pretty much any trench it came across. The FCM-2C was even heavier than the B1, and it only got outclassed by the Tiger II for weight, weighing in at almost 70 tons when loaded. The armour containing much of the extra weight, with 45mm of thick sloped armour at the nose and the turret, and 20mm of armour on the sides, but also the even longer hull, a rear crosstail. It could be fitted with a rear extra mobility stop so it can cross trenches, culminating with 12 metres, almost 40-foot long vehicle. The turret was enlarged and wide enough for 3 men, and now has a quick-firing, high-velocity 75mm gun. And rear turret was added with a single machine gun, both topped by cupolas. 2 other machine guns were placed in forward-facing barbettes, the fourth being a coaxial in the main turret. With such weight, the choice of an adequate engine now fell on the recently received German V12 Maybach engines previously used in the Zeppelin, which had the required power. Each propelled a single track via an electric transmission. So, like the Tiger P, it had an electric transmission and electric motor. It had a top speed of almost 10 miles per hour. They were fed by no less than 7 fuel tanks placed around the engine. The mechanics could access the compartment and work around the engine from inside like a submarine. The suspension was reinforced. With 39 small introverted road wheels on each side. The crew was 12 men, including commander, driver, gunner, loader, radio mechanic, his assistant, an electrician, and 4 machine gunners. Nearly 10 miles per hour, 45mm of armour, 75mm anti-tank cannon, 4 Hotchkiss 8mm machine guns. This would be an amazing Tier 2 premium. Okay, well, that's enough for this video. I think I've gone on for long enough. Next, I will cover more modern tanks in the tech tree. Now, the big question for me is, will France get German upgrades to their tanks as the Vichy French? And German forces used many of the tanks for upgrades. They made many interesting tank destroyers with them. However, I feel we will be getting American tanks to bulk up the forces, sadly, much like the aircraft tech tree. From 1940 to 1947, the French tanks were mainly captured enemy tanks or gifted tanks. Anyway, let me know below what you think. What do you expect to get for the French tech tree? And did you like this video? If you have a great day. Let me know below, and I will see you again soon. This is Screezilla out. Bye-bye.